Yeah, kinda, depending on how you look at it. Super Mario 3D All-Stars was the unceremonious release of Mario's 35th year anniversary. Before its announcement, it was rumored for a while that Nintendo was planning on remastering some Mario games for Mario's 35th birthday. The games in question were, of course, the first three 3D Mario games: Mario 64, Sunshine, and Mario Galaxy. Some were also hoping Galaxy 2 would be thrown in, but the realistic expectation was that it would only be those three. And the rumor would be proven to be true, so to speak. With the initial announcement trailer, there was some disappointment that the remastering in question was very minimal and hardly seen as an upgrade compared to how these games were played on the original consoles. Many compared to the original Super Mario All-Stars release on Super Nintendo, as that was a complete 16-bit overhaul of the original 2D Mario games. While I can understand that point of view, I'd still wager that the expectation for a 3D Mario compilation was still too high, even when using the original All-Stars as an example, but I'll go over as to why I feel that way later in the video. For now, the focus will be 3D All-Stars and to see how it pissed off so many Mario fans. Okay, before we do any deep diving, full disclosure, you can't buy this game anymore. Having this game be a limited release has got to be one of the dumbest decisions Nintendo has made for some time. Stopping production of physical copies? Sure, whatever. I mean, it's still extremely dumb regardless, but this game was going to sell an assload of copies anyway, so there will be plenty of physical carts in the wild for many years to come. But delisting it on the eShop makes no goddamn sense at all. And if it somehow does in some way, then someone please explain, because I can't fathom an explanation. Sure, for the past few years, physical carts of this game were still at the original MSRP of $60, and most retailers had it in stock. But we're now coming to the point where the rarity of this game is really starting to be felt. Most retailers are selling this at around $100, and it's really not because physical copies aren't being printed anymore. It's because it's not on the eShop. Look, this isn't going to be a physical versus digital debate, but I feel at best both mediums can at least keep the other in check in regards to pricing. Take a look at Metroid Prime Trilogy or the original Xenoblade Chronicles for Wii. They were limited releases here in North America and soon became quite scarce. You'd have been lucky to find either of these games for under $70 for several years. Then Nintendo added both of these titles to the Wii U eShop as virtual console titles for $20. As soon as this happened, physical copies of these games dropped dramatically in price, as there was no more incentive to seek them out outside of collector's purposes. Oh, and for the record, I have a not-for-resale copy of Prime Trilogy, which was just chilling at my local used game store for $60. I don't think they understood what they had, but it's by far my luckiest purchase. Anyway, for the average consumer, $20 for a digital copy is far more attractive than a $70+ physical copy. So if Nintendo had just let 3D All-Stars remain on the eShop, then I'd like to imagine it would have kept the price of physical copies in check for those who'd prefer it. I had a theory that Nintendo did it so they could have prepared another 3D All-Stars release that would have included Galaxy 2. They did the same sort of thing with Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, but that came out a year and a half after the original release. So unless Nintendo wants to prove me dead wrong, I don't think that's going to happen. It remains to this day as one of Nintendo's most baffling decisions, which frankly sucks because for the average gamer who has an interest in playing these games, then honestly, this is a fine compilation. Other content creators have already spoken their mind on the lackluster porting job of these games, and I do agree for the most part. After all, you take one look at fan efforts to improve the play experience of these games, and it's clear more is being done than what Nintendo is doing. The sad reality that I do feel these creators and their audience must understand is that they still only make up a fraction of the player base, and most casual gamers I've spoken to really wouldn't notice or care about the lack of quality improvements of 3D All-Stars. That's not to say neglecting improvements like these is forgivable or anything, but when taking in Nintendo's track record of retro game re-releases, that's ultimately the expectation to have going in. So let's go over 3D All-Stars again 3 years later and reevaluate if it's the complete dumpster fire most gaming content creators are making it out to be. So obviously you have the three main games on display here, but you also have the full complete soundtracks to these games, which is actually pretty cool. The second half of Mario Galaxy's OST was pretty rare for a while, so having the full track list here is nice. I think this is also the first time several tracks from Mario Sunshine were ever publicized, mainly the cutscene music, which would have otherwise had the other sound effects as part of the rip. Sorta like how the Smash Melee intro would always have the sound effects in every rip because the in-game sound test still had them. So above all else, having the highest quality, clean, full rips of the soundtracks is nice. Okay, Mario 64. First things first, and it's been said in every other video, but this release is based on the Japanese Shindo ROM. Mario 64 was released several times on the original Nintendo 64. The North American release fixed a few glitches from the original Japanese release and added several more sound effects, making for an overall more polished experience. This version would then be re-released in Japan, which also added rumble functionality, altered the pitch in some of the Mario voice clips, replaced the gay Bowser line, and fixed even more glitches, mainly speedrun related glitches such as the backwards long jump. This version is known as the Shindo release, and it's used for 3D All-Stars here. I'll start by saying I actually really enjoy the added rumble. It is used rather egregiously here, kind of being overdone at points, but for the most part I really like it. As far as the speedrun glitches being absent, I'm just gonna come out and say that people have been way too harsh regarding this topic. I can't say I agree with this notion that game re-releases need to appease speedrunners by sticking with a technically less polished release. Speedrunners usually stick to the original hardware or other emulated alternatives, so I don't really know what the fuss is. I understand the overall gameplay incentives for it. Many people like to create unique playthroughs that exploit glitches. I mean, I've done it too, with Metroid Prime on GameCube having a glitch to get the space jump boots really early that was removed in later releases. I'm not going to disagree that it can be good fun, but all in all these kinds of exploits, such as backwards long jump, are, at the end of the day, technical errors in the code that the devs just wanted to clean up. To be honest, I'd rather take the added rumble functionality and a more polished game than having the backwards long jump. I mean, I was never really good at it, so keep in mind I am still speaking for myself here. The audio for this release is a little muffled for some reason, and it's quite distracting at first, but I did forget about it after a few minutes of playing. It's still kinda lame regardless, since I can get better audio from the original console going to the same speakers. There also seems to be a bit of audio delay with various sound effects. This seems to be a new emulation issue that's been cropping up, so if you're sensitive to it, then it could be very distracting. However, I don't usually notice it much while I'm playing. The game is rendered at 720p, which many have claimed to be unacceptable because Sunshine and Galaxy run at 1080p, and with the advent of emulation being more than capable of running games at a higher resolution, then it can be seen as lazy on Nintendo's part to only stick with 720p for Mario 64. My only real problem with it is that it crops the image on the top and bottom, so the fact that it doesn't even fit the screen is just kind of unprofessional to me. Otherwise, I don't really care that it's only 720p. Look, N64 games haven't aged all that gracefully in my opinion, and having them rendered at a higher resolution only makes its age more jarring. Frankly, I would have preferred if Nintendo had stuck to keeping N64 games at their original 240p resolution. Sure, it's more pixelated this way, but it helps hide some of the imperfections of these older graphics, such as Mario's model dropping polygon count as the camera gets further away. At the original 240p resolution, you can't really tell, but at 720p and above, it's obvious and quite distracting to be honest. Another thing too with N64, but when you start increasing the resolution, a lot of the game's assets like textures and HUD elements gets filtered in a very ugly way that I've never liked. Check out the Wii U Virtual Console release and you'll see what I'm talking about. It just looks bad to me. That's one thing about 3D All-Stars that I do like, is that they redid many of the game's texture work. Mainly the HUD, which some have claimed to be AI upscaled, and maybe so, but overall I'd much rather have this than the shoddy filtered look from before. The final nail in this release's coffin that people are very upset about is how it still runs at 30 frames per second. I can't exactly defend this without sounding like an overly forgiving Nintendo shill. Of course, fans have had this game running on emulators at 60 FPS for a while now. In the discussion of game frame rates, I am of the camp that 60 FPS should be prioritized for optimal performance and player response, at least for platformers. Especially for a game re-release, upgrading to 60 over 30 should be one of the highest priorities. With that said, and again, I don't want to sound overly defensive, but this game still only being at 30 frames per second doesn't really bother me all that much. Look, I get it. I played Mario 64 at 60 frames per second and it does feel much better. Usually when experiencing an upgraded version of a game, it can make it really hard to go back to a previous release standard. Yet with Mario 64, even after playing the game at 60 frames for a while, it was surprisingly easy to readjust back to its original 30. Don't get me wrong, 60 is better, but still being 30 here doesn't really bother me that much. Regardless, that's how Nintendo wanted it. Looking at their history of game re-releases, they tend to be as bare bones as possible and strive to maintain the original experience as much as possible. One way that does aid in their benefit here is with the controls. In the past decade, there has been some fuss over how well this game controls all these years later. If you look at any review of this game from 2012 to 2020, it's likely the person reviewing the game will criticize Mario 64 for having sensitive, imprecise controls. It's also likely they'll be using the Virtual Console releases on Wii or Wii U. The problem isn't exactly with Mario 64, it's how these emulated Virtual Console releases don't do a good job at approximating the N64's analog stick sensitivity. If you try to perform slower, more precise movements in these versions with the Wii Classic controller or Wii U controller, you'll find it rather challenging as Mario accelerates far too quickly because the original analog input values aren't being faithfully represented. Along with the Wii U N64 Virtual Console having pretty bad input lag, the Virtual Console releases of Mario 64 have inadvertently soured this game's reputation when it comes to how well it controls. This problem thankfully isn't much of a thing with the release on 3D All-Stars. To my understanding, the analog sensitivity here for modern controllers, mainly the Switch Pro controller, is far closer to an original N64, meaning this release will control much closer to how it was on an original N64. This is further complemented with the Nintendo Switch Online Wireless N64 controller. This controller was originally designed and released for the Nintendo 64 Switch Online service, but support for this controller was eventually added into 3D All-Stars. This controller is pretty great as a modern N64 controller, complete with a fresh feeling analog stick. The analog sticks on original N64 controllers are infamous for how poorly they degrade over time. Several alternatives have surfaced over the years, and I'd recommend 8BitDo's new GameCube-style analog stick, mainly because good alternatives to the original stick design are very expensive. The Switch Online controller is, ironically, more affordable in that regard. And my current favorite way to go back to N64 games is with this controller along with a Bluetooth adapter for N64. Using this controller for 3D All-Stars feels pretty damn good, and it's how I would recommend newcomers to play Mario 64, if possible. And if not, this release still controls pretty damn well with the regular Switch controller. All in all, while this is a disappointing release for most gamers, it's still overall the best version of Mario 64 Nintendo has ever released. I know some people were expecting an Ocarina of Time 3D style remake, or maybe an updated version of Mario 64 DS with state-of-the-art modern graphics, but frankly that was always an unrealistic expectation. Nintendo makes it pretty clear that they're content with representing a game as close to how it was on its original release, with the least amount of modern updates possible, if they can rely on emulation to get it done. If you want to see what I mean, take a look at the recent releases of Pikmin 1 and 2 for Switch. I haven't played them, but just by looking at it, it seems like nothing more than a higher res versions of these games with minimal gameplay changes. My brother, who is a huge Pikmin fan, has played them and said that while they are fine versions of these games, he'll still swear that the Wii versions are the best because of the motion controls. Either way, Mario 64's aesthetic, sound, and controls were unlikely to be altered or upgraded by Nintendo. Sucks, but either way, all we were going to get is a minimally upgraded ROM of the original release. I'm probably more okay with that than some gamers, but I do understand most were let down. Super Mario Sunshine was by far the most interesting part of this compilation since it's the first time it's ever been re-released. Like with Mario 64, I feel everyone's expectations towards this version were perhaps too high. Mario Sunshine is one of the most contentious games in the franchise. This game strikes a nerve with most people, and gamers who were looking forward towards this release were hoping Nintendo would iron out many of the problems this game has for some people. I knew from the get-go that that wouldn't be the case, but even then, I was disappointed in several areas. The two biggest upgrades compared to the GameCube original is that the game is now in widescreen and runs at 1080p. Like with Mario 64, there's no 60 frames per second, which frankly is more disappointing here since, at least with Mario 64, it was common for 3D platformers at the time to be at 30 frames per second or even 20 frames per second. But even with the original GameCube release of Sunshine, it's a shame that the game is only in 30 FPS, when other platformers managed to comfortably achieve 60. Hell, they even had Sunshine running at 60 before the game's launch. So for them to not bring this game to 60 FPS for this release is more disappointing to me compared to Mario 64, especially since the frame pacing is somehow worse than the original release. Basically, it means the 30 FPS here feels worse than the 30 FPS in the original. Like, it feels more jittery to how it looked in the original, so that kinda sucks. Many of the graphical assets have also been updated, like with Mario 64, and I'm going to be dead ass when I say that it's probably my favorite thing about this release. I don't know, I just get a huge kick out of seeing all these HUD elements in complete clarity. It's not like there's anything else about this version that's vastly superior over the original. In fact, when 3D All-Stars launched, Mario Sunshine was shamefully the least polished game in the collection. I can't get footage myself since they've all been patched out, but think about how jarring it is that when 3D All-Stars launched, Mario Sunshine was littered with all sorts of technical blemishes. The game was in widescreen, yay, but it was clear the implementation wasn't sound since there were weird aspect ratio artifacts when underwater with the turbo nozzle. Trying to open up the map screen caused the frame rate to chug really bad. Several sound effects were not faithful to the original. The goddamn blocks from development builds were left intact. You know, I was really hoping 3D All-Stars could have paved the way for a rehabilitation of Mario Sunshine's reputation. But this release only made it worse with how blatant it was that Nintendo did not give a shit. But of course, all these technical bugs were patched out and now the game plays fine for the most part. But if there was one thing about the launch version that pissed me off was the absence of GameCube controller support. You know, I'm still bitter and perplexed about it, but Nintendo made this GameCube controller adapter for the Wii U only for Smash Bros. You still couldn't use GameCube controllers in the Wii U's Wii mode, or even Wii games that supported GameCube controllers. But I digress. They re-released this adapter for the launch of Smash Bros. Ultimate, but the real kicker is that the Switch's firmware accepts most generic USB controllers, and that includes this GameCube adapter. So basically, every game on Switch could be playable with the GameCube controller. At first, I wasn't really worried because, well, you'd be able to use a GameCube controller for Sunshine anyway. The reason this matters, to me at least, is because the GameCube controller, while not the best controller for most games, works especially well for the games it was designed for. It's why they keep bringing it back for Smash Bros. Because Melee plays so well with the GameCube controller. Sunshine 2 is a game that plays great with this controller. The face button placement, precise analog stick, and analog triggers would make playing Sunshine with any other controller quite challenging. But then it was realized that because the Switch doesn't typically use analog triggers, they had to alter the game to accommodate digital trigger buttons. Mario Sunshine had a pretty cool use of analog triggers where the pressure of water sprays was controlled by how far you press the trigger. GameCube triggers also had a digital click at the end, which would not only cause Mario to spray at max strength, but also plant his feet on the ground to aim at a standstill. It all came together very well and made for a great playing experience. The 3D All-Stars version accommodates digital triggers by having water sprays be at max strength by default, and having the bumper and trigger dictate spraying at a standstill or while running. Playing with the Switch Pro controller, it actually feels not that bad, and I'll say it's perfectly fine if it's your only option. Though you still lose minor gameplay features like delaying the rocket nozzle launch, and for the coaster sections you can hold down the trigger before the click, and doing so will cause the rockets to always fire straight, making for more accurate aiming, which is lost when using the Pro controller. So the default Switch controller is just fine, but damn, the GameCube controller still feels remarkably better. Not a problem though, right? Since the Switch natively accepts the GameCube adapter, right? Smash Ultimate proved that games could recognize the adapter with GameCube specificity. Well, too fucking bad, because Sunshine would not support GameCube controller functionality. Oh, you could still use the controller, but it won't play like how it did on the original because of the changes they made for modern controllers. Well, unfortunately, I'm stubborn as fuck, and hey, the Switch has a system-wide button remapping feature in the menu that doesn't support generic USB controllers. Do you want to know what I had to go through just to competently play Sunshine on Switch with a GameCube controller? I had to order 8BitDo's wireless adapter for Wii Classic controller and GameCube controller, which connects them as Switch Pro controllers, then remap the buttons to be as close to the GameCube layout as possible. Still not perfect since the analog triggers couldn't be used and the analog stick sensitivity was a little fucked up, so it didn't play as well as the original, but whatever. I could still use the GameCube controller and managed to fully complete Sunshine on this version with moderate satisfaction, shame, and guilt. But then they did add proper GameCube controller support. This was when they fixed all the technical issues that plagued this release. I guess as a bonus they thought, why not, and added a complete GameCube controller functionality. Now the buttons are all appropriately placed, and the analog triggers are still intact. The analog stick still feels a little too sensitive, and I swear this version has a little more input lag compared to the original, but I guess it isn't worth complaining about anymore. It's not like Nintendo will patch this game any further. The bump to 1080p does look much nicer here compared to the resolution increase of Mario 64. I feel once games hit GameCube, Xbox, and PS2, then they became graphically advanced enough to still be attractive at higher resolutions. Not like N64 or PS1 games. People were still hoping they'd make various gameplay changes like adding a blue coin tracker or making the game more non-linear, but like I said before, those were always unrealistically high expectations, I'm afraid. It's just not in Nintendo's MO to do that sort of thing for most of their re-releases. Take Metroid Prime Remastered. Yes, they totally overhauled the graphics. Yes, they added modern twin-stick controls as well as the Prime Trilogy pointer controls, but other than that, this release is still mostly one-to-one the same game. And this is for a standalone release. They'd probably have done less if it was part of a compilation. So either way, Sunshine was still going to be mostly the same game here, which does make me sad because I really like Sunshine and I will heavily defend this game. But even I'll admit it's hard when Nintendo continues to fumble around when they initially released it on Switch. Sunshine on Switch is still better than the original GameCube release despite the minor issues that remain, because I feel the resolution increase and widescreen are good enough upgrades. But it's hard not to just recommend playing on Dolphin if your computer is up to the task. The widescreen is a little bugged, but it doesn't break the game in any way, and the 60 FPS patch can cause further glitches to materialize. I guess in that way the Switch version is more polished in that regard. Again, those updated HUD textures do go a long way for me for some reason. But if you're willing to deal with a little extra jank, then having 60 FPS may be more than worth it. I'd still probably go back to the 3D All-Stars version just for convenience. As great as computer emulation is, I'll admit it can be tedious work just to get a game working fine. There might be some obscure setting you have to enable, maybe a graphics plugin you'll have to consider. Getting a controller connected to a PC can either be straightforward or a complete nightmare. That's the key word, convenience. As disappointing as 3D All-Stars is and how much more it could have been, it's still a very convenient way to play these games. And I think for the average casual gamer, that convenience goes a very long way. It does for me, even as someone who has spent hours tinkering with unorthodox gaming setups. At some point, it just becomes a pain in the ass when I just want to play a damn game, which leads us to the last game in this collection. Super Mario Galaxy had the least to get wrong since most people were going to be fine with the simple up-res. Mario Galaxy was always in widescreen and in 60 FPS, so besides resolution, there wasn't any more basic remaster material to work with. The HUD was once again redone, and once again, I probably like it more than most. I think it's because playing these games on Dolphin at higher res but with the same low quality HUD assets for so long just makes this small change have a little more impact to me. Some graphical effects, mainly the glowing effect that's present throughout the game, has pretty obvious banding that most won't notice, but it is distracting for those that do. And while the higher resolution is nice, it can cause some of the space tiling to be extremely obvious, where the lower resolution of the original makes it harder to notice. The one thing that was on people's minds was how the game was going to handle the pointer controls. Well, it's simple. Gyroscope, bitches. The Switch doesn't have a sensor bar to track a cursor, so it's all handled with the Switch's gyroscope. Gyro motion will always feel different than infrared motion, so if you're very used to how the original Galaxy's cursor handled, then it may take a bit to get used to in 3D All-Stars. But after a bit, it feels quite nice. The only thing to keep in mind is that the gyro will get out of sync frequently, so be aware there is a center button to recalibrate the cursor's positioning. Other than that, it plays just like how it did on the Wii. You can still shake the Joy-Con to perform the spin attack, but for this version they also mapped it to a button. I've heard some people describe it as a game changer because most people only like motion controls when it can do something better than conventional controller input. In that regard, it's true that using a button for the spin is more responsive, but in my opinion, it's still not as fun. Look, I get no one wants to be shaking the controller while they play, but I don't know, man. I felt it had a visceral feeling that just felt good when playing. Like whenever you break those ice crystals, you can't tell me it feels as good pressing a button as it does when you give the Wii Remote or Joy-Con a good waggle. If you want my theory, I believe they only had the spin mapped to a button because constantly shaking the Joy-Con would cause the cursor to desync way more often. And yes, I am saying Joy-Con because I don't think it's best to play with the Pro Controller. The cursor must be used with motion controls, and using both hands on a Pro Controller just feels awkward and not very intuitive. When playing portably on the Switch, you have to use the touchscreen, which I never tried because I know it's as bad as it sounds. I also remember hearing some critiques how when using the Joy-Cons, there's no option to use the left one to move the cursor to appease left-handed players. Well, if you remember my last video, I am left-handed and I don't think it would work as well as you'd think, because I still prefer to use the left analog stick to control character movement, and using the left stick on a controller I'm also moving around to control a cursor sounds cumbersome. I'm fine with the cursor stuck on the right Joy-Con since that feels most like using the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. Although, I have to admit, I still prefer playing with the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. The infrared motion cursor feels a lot more responsive and never goes out of sync. The cursor also tilts when you tilt the Wii Remote. You can't do that in 3D All-Stars. What the hell? I like that detail. This version sucks. In all seriousness, I also feel it controls slightly better on Wii. Since the game is designed around more angular level layouts that focuses more on 8-directional movement, it works better on the Nunchuck, which had an octagonal gate around the analog stick. The Joy-Con doesn't really have that, so movement feels ever so slightly inconsistent. So if 3D All-Stars looks better, and the Wii original plays better, in my opinion, then is the best of both worlds Dolphin? Well, could be. Like I said earlier, it can be a bit of a hassle to set up the emulator, getting all your graphics settings tweaked, getting a Wii Remote and Nunchuck connected, and getting a sensor bar set up, but once it's all said and done, then you do get the higher resolution of the Switch version, with the possibly superior controls of the Wii version. Not all the assets are as clean on Switch, mainly the HUD in certain areas, and cinematics still appear low res. Some have claimed that you can just download a texture pack for Sunshine and Galaxy for Dolphin, but in my opinion none of them look that great and most are unfinished, so why even bother? It's another reason Nintendo's own HUD updates hits different to me since they may be using the original uncompressed assets from the original development and they look so good. I haven't mentioned it yet, but 3D All-Stars also kinda cleans up all of the pre-rendered cutscenes from Sunshine and Galaxy, though to my understanding it is an AI upscale method of the original pre-renders rather than true re-renders of the original scenes. Don't get me wrong, it does look better on a modern display, but the low quality pre-renders of the original scenes never bothered me to begin with. Glow effects on Dolphin still have a little banding, so it's probably just a side effect of having a higher resolution, though it does look much worse on Switch, so it also could be the updated alpha textures. In my brief capture, I did run into a few stutters, but that may have just been because I was playing at 4K. Otherwise, Galaxy on Dolphin plays pretty damn well. I'll admit, I may still just side with playing on 3D All-Stars because, once again, convenience does a lot for me in this case. And if it plays good enough, then it plays good enough. Dolphin is still great, and probably best for newcomers now since, well, they can't buy 3D All-Stars anymore. Really, this entire video is kind of pointless because what's the point? This game isn't being sold anymore, so why bother giving it any more attention? Well, to be honest, I just wanted to reflect on this game since it's been 3 years since its release, and all the hate and disappointment has mostly faded. So I figure it was worth giving it another look all these years later to see if it was really as bad as people said it was. Well, I think my initial descriptor at the beginning of this video still describes 3D All-Stars best. unceremonious. This was the release for Mario's 35th year anniversary, so naturally people wanted so much more. But taking away the initial launch state of the game, away from the high expectations and away from all the backlash it's already received, was 3D All-Stars that bad? Kinda. It still depends on what your expectations are. But while not to sound too overly defensive, I think 3D All-Stars is perfectly fine and stands as the best official way to play these games. I get that Nintendo could have done much more. After all, emulation technology is a lot more versatile than what Nintendo displayed here. And while I did argue that setting up emulators is a little more of a hassle than other creators are willing to admit, especially for the average gamer, it only gives Nintendo further obligation to do it officially so that the average gamer wouldn't have to go through those hassles to experience those juicy emulator enhancements. But Nintendo. They must have felt that keeping Mario 64 at 4x3 and at 30 frames per second, as well as Sunshine, to be an integral part of their identity. Or that implementing improvements like widescreen or 60 FPS caused too many development problems to really bother with. So if you want to call that lazy, then you go right ahead, because that statement is still as valid as ever. But it's also still not surprising for Nintendo, and it's why I ultimately saw the state of 3D All-Stars coming long before it was announced. What I mean is, people will always bring up the original Super Mario All-Stars because that was a complete overhaul of the original 2D Mario games. Maybe, and don't misunderstand, I love Mario All-Stars, but I can't help people are giving it more credit than it needs. Yes, the graphics and sounds got upgraded thanks to the Super Nintendo's better audio and video capabilities. Yes, all the games got save features, whereas you couldn't save on NES. But despite that, the bottom line is that these games on Mario All-Stars still play almost one-to-one identically to their NES counterparts, which lines up to how Nintendo handled 3D All-Stars, where for the most part the games are essentially exactly the same with no extreme changes or differences. Most of the improvements are just par for the course by having these on Super Nintendo. More colors, added backgrounds, updated music. Even then, you can read how they deliberately tried to keep these games as close to the originals as possible. They didn't even add any additional frames of animation or any new gameplay functionality. They tweaked the difficulty by giving players more lives at the start, and the save system is nice but not quite as reliable as you'd think, since you can only save up to the current world you're in. Well, except for Mario Lost Levels, which saves you up to the current level you're on, but come on, that was needed because Lost Levels is, well, you know. What I'm trying to get at here is that while, yeah, Mario All-Stars is a sizable improvement over the NES originals, they are still basically one-to-one the same games. So much so that many gamers actually still prefer the original NES versions for nostalgia, or because that NES aesthetic just hits better for them. So when thinking about just how Nintendo was going to re-release the 3D Mario games, I think they did almost exactly how I expected them to. Not to say I would have wanted more, but with modern emulation being an option, then it's ultimately what I expected. Even then, I still had my own personal disappointments that I discussed earlier. So yeah, 3D All-Stars is still that bad. But is it bad? I wouldn't say so. If you compare it to fan efforts on unofficial emulation, then it can seem unflattering to 3D All-Stars. But just remember what I said about a casual gamer's expectation and convenience. It's the same way I feel about the original Mario All-Stars. Ultimately, I'll recommend them over the originals just because they're a prettier, more convenient way to play the 2D Mario games. Same way I'd recommend 3D All-Stars as just prettier, more convenient ways to play the 3D Mario games. If you could still buy it. But you can't. Not anymore. If you do, however, want to see a more advanced way to play the 2D Mario games, with more modern sensibilities and gameplay improvements, then maybe we can talk about that next time. But for now, I think that will be all for me today, so let me just say, thank you for watching.